Too cold, we must share one bed, the outcast woman's command on the frontier. The wind cut through the forest like a sharp blade, carrying with it the bitter bite of winter. Snow drifted across the frozen ground, piling high against the sides of small log cabins that dotted the edge of the frontier settlement. Each cabin looked weary under the weight of ice, their roofs bending slightly from the relentless winter storms. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, the only sign that someone lived there, braving the cold that seemed determined to consume everything in its path. Through the swirling snow and biting wind, a lone figure made her way along the narrow trail that connected the cabins. She was wrapped tightly in a thick, worn coat, the fur collar pulled high around her neck. Her boots sank into the snow with every step, leaving uneven tracks behind her. She paused often, not only to catch her breath but also to scan the horizon. The frontier was merciless, but she had been traveling for days and had learned to respect its dangers. She was not afraid, not in the usual way, though she carried the weight of her past like an invisible pack. Her name was Eliza. People in the nearby town had called her an outcast, and she had heard their whispers and seen their pointed fingers. For as long as she could remember, they could not forgive her independence, nor the way she refused to follow their strict rules. She had been strong, too strong for their liking, and in their eyes that made her dangerous, so she left. She had no destination in mind, only the hope of finding a place where she could exist without judgment, a place where the wind and snow were the only voices she had to answer to. The settlement she now approached was small, no more than a handful of cabins huddled against the trees, as if seeking shelter from the harsh wind. The people here were rugged and practical, the kind who knew how to survive with little more than the clothes on their backs and the tools in their hands. They were wary of strangers, and rightfully so. Life on the frontier demanded caution, and those who were reckless often did not last long. Eliza understood this. She had learned to carry her caution with her, like a shield, and to keep her intentions clear. She did not come here to cause trouble. She only sought warmth, food, and a place to rest her weary body. Her eyes fell upon a cabin at the edge of the settlement. It was smaller than the others, its walls darkened by smoke and age. She had heard stories of the man who lived there, one of the few who preferred solitude to company. People called him a trapper, though he also hunted and fished enough to provide for himself throughout the long winters. He was known to be stubborn, proud, and wary of outsiders, traits that might make him seem unwelcoming. Yet something about his cabin called to her. Perhaps it was the smoke curling from the chimney, a sign that warmth and life persisted inside. Perhaps it was the promise of shelter that she so desperately needed. Eliza hesitated at the edge of the clearing, unsure whether to approach. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself, the wind pressing against her as if to test her resolve. She could hear the distant howl of wolves, a reminder that the wilderness did not forgive mistakes. Her heart pounded not only from the cold, but also from the uncertainty of what awaited her. She knew she could not turn back. The storm was coming, heavier than anything she had faced so far. If she did not find shelter soon, she risked frostbite or worse. Summoning her courage, she stepped forward, her boots crunching in the fresh snow. She made her way to the cabin, pausing only when she reached the wooden door. She knocked gently at first, not wanting to startle anyone inside, but the sound echoed loudly in the quiet of the snowy forest. There was no answer. She knocked again, a bit harder, her voice catching slightly as she called out. "Hello?" she said, her words almost lost in the wind. "Please, I need shelter. Just for a night." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the door creaked open. A man appeared in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by years of exposure to the cold. His eyes were cautious, studying her carefully from beneath thick eyebrows. He was dressed simply, in a thick woolen shirt and worn trousers, his hands calloused from labor. He did not speak at first, merely observing her, as though deciding whether she posed a threat. Eliza began, but the words caught in her throat, the wind cut at her voice, and she had not expected the hesitation to feel so heavy. She straightened, trying to appear confident, though her teeth chattered slightly. I have traveled far. The storm is coming. I mean no harm. I only need a place to stay for the night. The man studied her for several long seconds, his eyes narrowing. You're alone, he said finally, his voice deep and measured. The storm is bad tonight. The woods are dangerous. Why should I let you in? Eliza swallowed. She had anticipated his suspicion, but hearing it aloud still made her stomach twist. Because if I stay outside, I might not survive the night, she said honestly. I do not ask for charity. I ask for a chance to live through the storm. The man's eyes softened slightly, though the edge of caution never left him. People around here don't take kindly to strangers, he said. Especially not women traveling alone. I understand, she replied quietly. I have experienced their judgment before. I do not expect understanding. I only need shelter. That is all. For a moment he said nothing. The wind howled around the cabin, rattling the wooden walls and shaking the thin window panes. Both of them stood in tense silence, listening to the roar of the storm outside. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he stepped aside. Come in, he said gruffly. But you stay near the fire! Don't wander around! And don't expect me to make company for you. I live alone for a reason.
Eliza nodded, relief washing over her. She stepped inside, grateful for the warmth that immediately enveloped her.
The cabin was small but cozy, filled with the scent of wood smoke and dried herbs. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, throwing flickering shadows across the walls. She removed her coat and boots, setting them near the door to dry her hands, already beginning to thaw from the cold. The man watched her quietly, leaning against the doorframe. He did not offer a smile or any words of comfort, but his presence was a reassurance of safety nonetheless. Eliza moved carefully, noting the simplicity of his life. There were shelves with neatly stacked supplies, a few hunting tools, and a small table with chairs. It was clear that he relied on his own skill and determination to survive, much like she had. As she warmed herself by the fire, Eliza felt a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. She knew that the frontier was a place of opportunity, yes, but also of danger. Survival here required not only strength of body, but strength of character, and she would need both to endure what was coming. She glanced at the man who was now tending to the fire, his movements precise and practiced. She sensed that he had seen much in his life, and perhaps, like her, he had learned the value of self-reliance. Outside, the storm began to intensify. Snow fell heavier now, driven by gusts of wind that rattled the cabin walls. Eliza wrapped her hands around a warm cup of tea the man had offered, simple, strong, and sustaining, and watched the snow through the window. She thought of the road she had traveled, the towns that had rejected her, and the nights spent shivering under the stars. Here, in this small cabin at the edge of the frontier, she felt the first real sense of possibility she had known in months. The man, whose name she had yet to learn, continued his quiet work around the cabin. Occasionally their eyes met, and a silent understanding passed between them. Words were not necessary. Both recognized the harshness of the world outside, and the fragile safety of warmth and shelter. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and the snow fell relentlessly. But inside there was a fragile bubble of life and hope that neither could deny. Eliza settled herself near the hearth, allowing the heat to seep into her frozen limbs. She did not speak, and neither did the man, but there was a sense of connection, however small, that bridged the gap between their solitary lives. In that moment, she realized that survival was not just about enduring the cold, it was also about finding people, even strangers, who could offer the simplest form of humanity, shelter, warmth, and the recognition of another life. Night began to fall, and with it the full force of the storm. Eliza listened to the wind and snow, feeling both fear and determination. She knew the frontier would not be kind, but she had come prepared to face it, and she had found a small sanctuary, however tentative. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, she had survived the first trial, and in surviving she felt the faint spark of possibility, that perhaps even on the harshest frontier, a place existed where she could belong, if only for a night. The night grew darker. and the wind outside seemed to roar, louder than ever. Snow whipped against the cabin walls, rattling the thin panes of glass in the window and making the logs groan under the weight of ice and frost. The man moved quietly around the small cabin, checking the fire, stacking more wood, and ensuring the small home remained as secure as possible. Every sound from the outside world, the howl of distant wolves, the cracking of branches under the weight of snow, even the whistle of the wind through small gaps in the cabin walls, reminded him that the frontier never forgave carelessness. Eliza sat close to the fire, feeling the warmth slowly creeping into her frozen limbs. Her body had relaxed somewhat after hours of shivering outside, yet her mind remained alert. She could hear every shift in the cabin, every small noise, and every gust of wind. Life on the frontier demanded constant attention, and she had learned that much the hard way. She had seen travelers less cautious than herself vanish in the white expanse of snow, leaving only footprints that were quickly erased by the wind. Despite the comfort of the fire, a chill persisted in the room. The wind seemed to seep through the cracks in the cabin walls, sneaking in and brushing cold fingers along her shoulders. Eliza pulled her coat closer around her, but she knew that it would not last through the night. The man, noticing her discomfort, added another log to the fire. The flames leapt higher, casting a flickering orange glow across the room. Smoke curled upward and disappeared into the chimney, carrying with it a faint scent of pine and burning wood. "The storm is worse than I thought," he said, his voice low but steady. He did not look directly at her, but continued to feed the fire. "It will last all night. The snow will pile high, and the wind will not stop." Eliza nodded, swallowing hard. "I can see that," she said softly. Her voice sounded small against the roar of the storm outside. "I've traveled through storms before, but nothing like this." He glanced at her, studying her face in the firelight. There was determination in her eyes, but there was also a vulnerability that could not be hidden. "You're brave," he said finally. "Or perhaps foolish." She met his gaze, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Maybe a bit of both," she admitted. "But bravery alone won't keep me alive tonight." The man remained silent, returning to his work. He had seen many travelers like her, people who underestimated the power of the frontier. But there was something different about this woman. She carried herself with a quiet strength, the kind that came from facing rejection and hardship time and again. He had never seen someone so determined to survive, not just for themselves but without causing trouble for others. Hours passed slowly. Outside, the storm raged with relentless force. Inside, the cabin was quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the occasional groan of the logs. Eliza tried to stay warm, rubbing her hands together and sipping a small cup of water the man had offered earlier. Yet the cold seemed to seep into her bones, refusing to be chased away by fire alone. She shivered despite the layers of clothing, realizing that the night would be longer and harsher than she had imagined. The man finally spoke again, his tone thoughtful. "You can't stay like that. You'll freeze before morning if you sit there. You need real warmth, something more than the fire." Eliza looked up at him, puzzled. "What do you mean?" He hesitated as if weighing the words. Then he spoke plainly. "The fire isn't enough. The wind is too strong. If you don't find another way to keep warm, you'll suffer frostbite. Maybe worse." Her heart began to pound. She understood exactly what he meant. The storm was not just a nuisance, it was a threat to her life. Every minute she spent in the cabin cold and exposed increased the risk, and yet the idea of asking for something more personal, more intimate, felt impossible. She had grown up in a world where people judged women for any small action outside strict rules, where independence was punished. Asking for help, asking for warmth, it felt like stepping into forbidden territory. She hesitated, debating what to do. Survival demanded action, yet her pride whispered against it. The man noticed her struggle and looked at her quietly, as if understanding without words. There was no judgment in his gaze, only the simple observation of someone facing a life or death choice.
"Will you help me?" she asked finally, her voice small but firm.
I I need to survive this night. He paused, measuring her words. The wind outside howled, the cabin shook, and the snow continued to fall relentlessly. The thought of the dangers beyond the walls pressed heavily on both of them. He could leave her to figure it out on her own, as many in the frontier would have, or he could do something that went against the rules of propriety, but kept a life safe. "Step over here," he said finally, motioning toward the bed in the corner of the cabin. "You'll have to share it. There's no other way to stay warm."
Eliza's eyes widened.
She had expected caution, perhaps, silence, but not this direct offer. Her mind raced. The bed was small, meant for one person. She had never shared such a personal space with a stranger, not in all her life. Yet the cold outside, the threat of frostbite, and the certainty that the storm would last until morning left her no choice. "Thank you," she said softly, stepping toward the bed. Her hands shook, partly from the cold, partly from the tension of the situation. She climbed onto the rough blanket, careful not to touch the man unnecessarily, and tried to focus on the warmth radiating from him in the fire. He climbed onto the bed as well, careful to maintain distance but close enough to share the warmth necessary for survival. At first, the silence was almost unbearable, each aware of the awkwardness of the situation. Yet the practical necessity of their proximity overcame the discomfort. The firelight danced across their faces, casting long shadows on the walls. The storm outside drowned out everything else, leaving them in a small, isolated world of ice, fire, and quiet human connection. Minutes stretched into hours. The cold pressed against them relentlessly, but their bodies shared heat, and slowly the danger of frostbite began to fade. Eliza's shivering lessened, replaced by a cautious sense of security. The man remained alert, listening to the wind, watching for the groan of logs, the creak of branches. He was protective, not out of affection, but because he understood the stakes. This was survival, not social convention. Gradually, the conversation began. At first in whispers. They spoke of trivial things, where the man had learned to trap, the stories of his travels through the forest, the supplies he kept for winter. Eliza shared carefully, speaking of her journeys, the rejection she had faced, the lessons she had learned. They were careful not to reveal too much, yet every word built a bridge across the silence, a fragile connection forming under the harsh conditions of the frontier. The storm continued outside, relentless and unforgiving, but inside, a quiet understanding began to emerge. Both recognized that the night could have ended differently. Either of them could have refused, leaving the other to face the merciless cold. Yet here they were, united by necessity, learning the value of trust and the strength that could be found in shared hardship. As the night deepened, Eliza realized that this moment would stay with her long after the storm had passed. The cold, the fear, the uncertainty, they had all been overcome by cooperation, by the willingness of two strangers to set aside pride and judgment in the face of danger. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and the snow continued to fall. But inside the cabin, warmth was more than physical. It was the quiet bond of human survival. The man finally spoke again, breaking the silence that had grown comfortable. "You'll make it through this night," he said simply. "The storm will end. But you've learned something tonight, too, about how the frontier works. It doesn't forgive weakness, but it does reward those who act when it matters most." Eliza nodded, her thoughts echoing his words. She had acted when it mattered most, and the night had been survived because of it. Fear had been replaced by respect, uncertainty by trust. The storm would pass, but the lesson of the night would remain. Sometimes survival required courage, humility, and the willingness to accept help, even in ways that felt unfamiliar or uncomfortable. Hours passed, and exhaustion began to claim them both. The fire dwindled to glowing embers, and their breathing slowed in the quiet of the cabin. Outside the storm raged, but inside life persisted. They had survived the first test of the winter night, learning the fragile balance of independence and trust. And though neither spoke of it aloud, both understood that this shared experience would shape them in ways the cold could never touch. By the time dawn approached, the wind had eased slightly, and the snow settled into quiet drifts. The storm was far from over, but the immediate danger had passed. Eliza felt the warmth of the fire and the man's steady presence beside her. She knew that whatever challenges the day would bring, they had faced the night together and survived. The night stretched on, and the storm outside showed no signs of easing. Snow pressed against the cabin walls, piled high and drifting in uneven heaps that the wind sculpted into sharp, jagged shapes. The howl of the wind was constant, rising and falling like the cry of some great, unseen creature. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire provided comfort, but it was fragile. Every now and then a gust slipped through a crack in the walls, carrying with it the icy chill of the winter wilderness. Eliza shifted slightly on the bed, careful not to disturb the man beside her. She was grateful for the shared warmth, but she was also aware of the closeness the night demanded. Every muscle in her body was tired from travel, from shivering, from maintaining the sharp awareness that survival required. Her mind, however, was alert, listening to the rhythm of the storm, the soft crackle of the fire, and the even breathing of the man nearby. He seemed lost in thought, his eyes focused on the flickering flames. Every so often he would glance at her, not with judgment, but with quiet consideration. There was a mutual understanding between them, born out of necessity that did not require words. They were strangers, yes, but in that small cabin faced with the relentless winter, they were allies, united by the simple yet powerful need to survive. Finally, breaking the long silence, the man spoke. "I didn't expect someone like you to make it this far," he said slowly, his voice low but steady. "Most would have turned back, or worse." Eliza looked at him, curious despite herself. "Someone like me?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," he replied, strong-willed, independent, stubborn. "People don't like it when you don't follow their rules. Most places you've been, they wouldn't have let you pass." Her lips curved into a small, wry smile. "I suppose that's true," she admitted. "I've had my share of judgment and rejection, but I've also learned that life is too short to live under other people's rules. Sometimes survival demands your own path, even if it's lonely." He nodded slowly as if considering her words. "Lonely, yes, that's the frontier for you," he said. "People come here thinking it's freedom, but freedom can be harsh. There's no one to watch your back if you make a mistake. And the winter doesn't care about your plans or your pride." Eliza listened, feeling a strange kinship with him. His words echoed her own thoughts, the lessons she had learned on her journey. She realized that the man, despite his gruff exterior, understood the value of resilience and the cost of survival. In the silence that followed, she felt a shift, something subtle but significant. The cabin, once merely a shelter, was becoming a place of shared understanding. The fire flickered, casting dancing shadows across the wooden walls. Eliza drew her knees close to her chest, feeling the warmth spread through her. She could sense the man's vigilance beside her, his eyes occasionally glancing toward the window, listening for the slightest hint of danger. The storm outside continued unabated, yet inside there was a fragile calm. It was the calm of two people who knew that the world outside was harsh, but together they had carved a small sanctuary. "I've traveled for weeks," Eliza said, her voice quiet, reflective, "through forests, over mountains, across frozen rivers. I've seen people give up, lose hope. I didn't want to be one of them. That's why I keep moving, no matter how hard it gets." The man considered her words. "You're brave," he said again, this time with a hint of admiration. "Not many would have survived this long alone through this storm. You're determined." "I can respect that." She nodded, feeling a warmth beyond the fire spreading through her chest. "Determined," she echoed. "I've had to be. There were times I had nothing, no family, no friends, no one to rely on. I learned early that waiting for help only leaves you cold and hungry. You have to act even when the world seems against you." He studied her silently, his expression unreadable in the firelight. Then, after a long pause, he said, "You've had to learn the hard way. I've been alone out here for years, and I know what you mean. Trust is scarce, and most people, they fail when you need them most. But tonight we trust each other. Eliza's eyes softened. Trust was something she had given sparingly, reserved for the rare few who proved themselves through actions rather than words. Here, in the middle of a relentless storm, with survival hanging in the balance, trust had become a necessity. She realized that their shared struggle had forged a bond stronger than politeness or small talk could ever create. They continued in silence for a while, each lost in their thoughts. The man tended the fire occasionally while Eliza stared into the dancing flames, imagining the paths she had taken to reach this point. She thought of the towns she had left behind, of faces twisted in disapproval, of doors that had been closed in her face. And yet, none of it mattered now. What mattered was survival, warmth, and the fragile connection she had formed with this stranger who had offered her shelter without question. Hours passed, and the cold began to press in more insistently. Eliza could feel it in her bones, the way the chill crept into the smallest spaces, seeking out weakness. She shivered despite the shared warmth, realizing that the fire alone could not keep her fully safe. The man noticed her discomfort and shifted slightly, moving closer without words, offering more of his body heat in silent support. "You're cold," he said simply, his tone factual rather than emotional. "The fire helps, but it's not enough. You need more warmth." Eliza's heart pounded. She knew exactly what he meant. The night was far from over, and the storm would continue to rage for hours. Yet she had no illusions about the danger. Frostbite and exhaustion were real threats, and the longer they waited, the more urgent the need for warmth became. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Survival demanded courage, and courage sometimes required setting aside pride. She looked at him, her eyes steady. "You're right," she said quietly. I need to survive this night. I cannot risk the cold any longer." The man nodded, understanding her without hesitation. "Then we share the bed," he said simply, his voice calm and practical. "It's the only way to stay warm. There's no other choice." Eliza's pulse quickened. She had expected caution, perhaps a test of trust, but not this direct statement. Yet the urgency of the storm, the biting cold, and the certainty of survival left her no choice. She nodded silently, agreeing to the arrangement, and shifted closer, careful to respect boundaries while still gaining the warmth she desperately needed. The night became a lesson in patience, endurance, and human connection. They lay side by side, not speaking at first, each aware of the other's presence. The cold pressed against them, unrelenting, but together they shared the strength necessary to endure it. Every small movement, every adjustment, was guided by survival instincts and mutual respect. Gradually, the awkwardness faded, replaced by a quiet understanding. They began to speak in whispers, sharing stories of their pasts, their struggles, and their journeys. Eliza spoke of the towns that had rejected her, the harsh lessons she had learned, and the determination that had carried her this far. The man spoke of life on the frontier of solitude, and of the wisdom gained from years of observing nature and human behavior alike. In the flickering firelight, a connection grew. One forged not in comfort or ease, but in the necessity of survival. They learned to rely on each other in ways neither had expected. Trust, once scarce, now became a lifeline. The storm outside, though relentless, could not penetrate the fragile bond forming inside the cabin. Time passed slowly. Outside, the wind shrieked and the snow drifted higher. But inside, warmth persisted. Not just the warmth of the fire or of shared body heat, but the warmth of mutual understanding and respect. They were no longer strangers, facing each other with caution. They were companions, united by circumstance and strengthened by the recognition that survival sometimes required cooperation beyond social convention. Eliza felt her heart lighten, even as her body remained tense against the cold. She realized that this night, harsh as it was, had given her more than shelter. It had given her a glimpse of trust, of shared humanity, and of the courage to accept help when life demanded it. The man in turn seemed to soften, his usual caution tempered by recognition of her strength and determination. The hours slipped by, marked only by the shifting firelight and the distant relentless howl of the wind. Each understood that this night would end, that the storm would pass, and that the frontier would continue to demand strength and resilience. Yet in these long hours they had discovered something unexpected, the power of connection in the harshest of circumstances. As dawn began to hint at the horizon, pale light filtering through the snow-streaked window, they lay quietly, exhausted but alive. The storm, though not fully ended, had been endured. The night had tested them, but it had also taught them the value of trust, courage, and the quiet strength found in shared survival. Eliza knew that she would never forget this night, the night she had faced the storm, shared warmth with a stranger, and discovered that even in the coldest, harshest conditions, human connection could provide more heat than fire alone. The first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, soft and pale against the endless white of the snow-covered landscape. The storm had not fully passed, but the wind had softened, and the harsh, cutting blizzards of the night were giving way to quiet drifts of snow that sparkled in the early light. Inside the small cabin, the fire had dwindled to glowing embers, casting a warm, flickering light across the wooden walls. Eliza stretched slightly, careful not to disturb the man beside her, and felt a sense of calm she had not experienced in weeks. The night had been long, frightening, and exhausting. Yet they had survived. The cabin was quiet, save for the occasional pop of the cooling embers and the soft creak of the logs as they settled in the changing temperatures. Eliza's body ached from the long night spent huddled for warmth, but her spirit felt lighter. She looked at the man, noticing the faint lines of fatigue around his eyes, the deep calm in his posture, and the way he seemed at peace despite the storm's aftermath. Survival, she realized, had changed them both in small but significant ways. The man stirred, stretching his arms and shoulders. "The worst of it seems over," he said, his voice low but steady. "The snow has stopped and the wind has died down. You'll be able to travel soon if you need to."
Eliza nodded, feeling gratitude mixed with the quiet pride of having endured the night.
"Thank you," she said softly. "For everything. For letting me in. For warmth. For trust." "I don't take it lightly." He shrugged slightly, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "It was the right thing to do, that's all. The frontier doesn't forgive mistakes. I've lived long enough to know that helping someone when it matters most can make the difference between life and death." Eliza looked around the cabin, noticing the small signs of care the man had taken. Extra wood stacked neatly by the door, the small pot of water kept simmering near the fire, blankets folded on the bed. These were small, simple gestures, yet they spoke volumes about his character. Here was a man who had spent years surviving alone, and yet he had shown kindness without expectation.
"I've traveled through many places," Eliza said, her voice thoughtful.
Some were cruel, some indifferent, and some taught me lessons I'll never forget. But tonight was different. You didn't ask me to justify myself, to explain why I am alone. You offered what I needed without question. That means more than I can say." The man nodded slowly, taking a seat on a chair near the embers. "I've learned that survival isn't just about skill or strength," he said. "It's about judgment. Knowing when to act, when to trust, when to protect someone. You earned that trust tonight, and it was deserved. Not everyone could have survived the storm the way you did." Eliza smiled faintly, feeling warmth spread through her, not just from the fire or shared bed, but from the quiet affirmation of her resilience. She realized that the night had tested more than her body. It had tested her judgment, her courage, and her ability to rely on someone else when life demanded it. In that small cabin she had discovered a simple truth. Even the strongest, most independent person sometimes needs help, and accepting it does not diminish strength. It proves it. As they spoke, the storm outside continued to fade, leaving the world blanketed in sparkling snow. The trees were coated in frost, their branches weighed down by the thick accumulation, and the distant mountains were softened by the haze of lingering snow. It was a beautiful sight, quiet and serene, and it brought with it a sense of possibility. Eliza realized that the frontier, harsh as it was, also offered moments of breathtaking peace and wonder. Moments that reminded her why she had left behind the towns that had judged her so harshly. "I should move on soon," Eliza said, her voice calm but firm. "I can't stay in one place for too long." The frontier has its own rules, and part of survival is knowing when to keep going. The man nodded, understanding. "You're right. Staying too long can be as dangerous as facing a storm unprepared. But take what you've learned here with you. Remember that trust and courage are as important as skill."
Eliza looked at him, realizing that she had grown not just in strength, but in perspective.
She had come to the frontier seeking shelter, but she had found more than that. She had discovered the quiet power of human connection, even in the harshest conditions. The man had shown her that survival was not just about facing the cold or the wilderness alone, but about knowing when to let someone else share the burden, even for a single night. They sat in silence for a few minutes, listening to the soft whisper of the wind through the trees and the occasional distant sound of falling snow.
The cabin felt like a small island of warmth in a vast frozen world.
The night had been difficult, testing every skill, every instinct, every ounce of courage they possessed. And yet, they had endured. Together, finally, Eliza rose, gathering her few belongings and preparing to step back into the wilderness. She looked at the man, gratitude shining in her eyes. "I will not forget this," she said softly. "Not just the shelter, but the trust, the guidance, and the strength you've shown me. It's more than I expected, and I am thankful." The man nodded, his expression serious but calm. "You survived, and you learned," he said simply. "That's enough. Keep moving. Keep trusting your instincts, and don't forget what you've learned here." Eliza stepped to the door, pausing to look back at the small cabin now quiet under the soft morning light. She felt a deep sense of respect for the man, and for the frontier itself, the harsh, beautiful, unforgiving place that demanded courage and rewarded resilience. She realized that the night had changed her. She had been tested by the storm, by the cold, and by the necessity of sharing trust with a stranger. And she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more aware of the value of human connection. The man watched her go, his eyes following her footprints in the fresh snow as she disappeared down the trail. He felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that he had done the right thing, and that the frontier had tested them both in its own relentless way. He returned to the small tasks of daily life, stacking wood, checking supplies, and preparing for the days ahead. Yet there was a small warmth in his chest, a recognition that survival was not only about skill or solitude, but about the courage to act and the wisdom to trust when it mattered most. Eliza moved steadily along the trail, her body still sore, but her spirit strong. The snow crunched beneath her boots, and the cold air filled her lungs, sharp and bracing. She thought back to the night, the long hours spent huddled for warmth, and the quiet trust that had grown between her and the man. She realized that survival was not merely about enduring the elements. It was about understanding oneself, understanding others, and finding strength in unexpected places. As the sun climbed higher, the world seemed to sparkle with possibility. The snow glinted like diamonds in the morning light, and the trees stood tall, resilient despite the weight of frost. Eliza felt a sense of clarity she had never known before. The frontier was harsh, yes, but it was also a place of learning, of growth, and of discovery. And in surviving the night, she had discovered something more important than warmth or shelter. She had discovered courage, trust, and the quiet power of connection. Hours passed as she traveled, the trail winding through forests and across frozen streams. She encountered signs of life, tracks of deer in the snow, the distant cry of birds, and the occasional movement of other travelers braving the cold. Each sight reminded her that life continued, even in the harshest conditions, and that resilience was rewarded in subtle, often unseen ways. By midday, she reached the edge of the next settlement. The cabins were small and clustered together, smoke curling lazily from chimneys, much like the place she had left behind. Yet this time she felt different. She was not simply seeking shelter or warmth. She was carrying experience, knowledge, and the quiet confidence of someone who had faced danger and emerged stronger. She paused at the edge of the settlement, taking a deep breath of the crisp, cold air. The memory of the night, the storm, and the shared trust lingered, a warm glow against the chill of the world. She knew that she would never forget the lessons learned in that small cabin on the frontier, and that the bond forged in the harshest of nights would remain a quiet source of strength and reflection for years to come. Eliza walked into the settlement with a renewed sense of purpose. She moved carefully, aware of the challenges ahead, but also aware of her own resilience. She had survived the storm, trusted another person, and learned the quiet strength of connection. And as she stepped forward, she knew that the frontier, harsh and unforgiving as it was, had given her a gift, a lesson in courage, trust, and the enduring power of the human spirit. Even as the cold wind continued to whisper through the trees and the snow shimmered in the brightening light, Eliza felt a sense of peace. She had faced the storm and the unknown, and she had emerged not only alive, but stronger, wiser, and more capable than she had ever imagined. The frontier had tested her, and she had answered with courage and determination, and in doing so she had discovered that even in the coldest, harshest places, warmth could be found, not only in fire and shelter, but in trust, connection, and the shared experience of survival.